Hello, Chris. Welcome to the Sunseeker podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. Sunseeker is an expansion mental health podcast, kind of in the consciousness space. And I thought that it would be really great to kind of learn a little bit about you and some of the work that you've done. I know that essentially you're not just a wellness leader, but you have a master's in psychology, and you've served as the director of wellness for the Colorado Department of Public Safety, and spiritual guide and a longtime Sufi. So just wanted to welcome you and thank you just for bringing all of your knowledge and gifts to myself and the audience.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me, Christian. I'm really curious to see where this conversation goes today, and if it piques some interest and questions that some of your audience hasn't had before, fantastic. So, looking forward to it.
Right on. Right on. So I just wanted to, go back to maybe just like the origins of when you kind of found your knack for spirituality, or felt kind of like the inclination towards this kind of work.
Well, okay. So, I let me start by saying that for me, it's actually not work. It's it's really just an expression of who I am. And so, to that question, I haven't really thought about this a whole lot, but the story, I guess for me, it goes back to when I was a really little kid. I go back to some of my earliest memories, maybe 3, 4 years old, where I lived in a rural part of Sacramento County in California, and it was for me it was a bit of a wonderland at that age. As an adult, I think it would have been a really depressing place, but for me at the time, it was full of all kinds of imagination, and I had access to these places where there were discarded concrete sewer pipes and a gravel quarry and an old little pump house from an 1800s farm that still had water flowing through it, and alfalfa fields. So it was a really somewhat magical place. But I know that the reality was my family was in very difficult times at that point. But I didn't know anything about that. For me, it was just going out into nature, wandering around, connecting with just the energies of the place. And for me, I always felt a connection to something other than myself being there. So there's always this sense that I wasn't entirely alone. And those are my earliest memories. And so when I go back to those, I say, okay, that was the beginning of having some other awareness. But if we fast forward through the years, as it turns out, my dad was a Protestant minister, so he was a pastor at different churches growing up, which I personally I could barely tolerate being there. I mean, it was about all I could do just to, not explode as a kid at church. And pretty much I spent my time hiding from other people and escaping church in one way or another. When I was 15, we moved up to Canada and Toronto, and my dad was the pastor of a Chinese church in Chinatown, which for me as a 15, 16-year-old was basically a ticket into one of the best cities in the world to wander around on a Sunday morning by myself instead of being in church. But I always had questions. I think that's maybe the place for me to pick up. I always had questions that either I didn't quite know how to express in words, just things that were really about what moves me. And why don't I always seem to see that in others around me? They talk about stuff like love, they talk about how important it is to be a good person, but I wasn't seeing it, at least not in everyone. And so I was always looking, looking, looking. And in some of my expeditions around Toronto, or just being alone in nature, that's when I felt my connections. That led me to reading books. I was very curious growing up. I read tons of poetry, tons of philosophy. I read that. That's how I actually came across Sufism. As I stumbled across the Sufi poets, Hafiz in particular, and then Rumi and some of the other ones. And that grew and grew for me. And you cut me off at any point if I'm talking too long, but
No, it's great.
but the but the the progression for me was one of feeling really out of my element, in the setting of religion and organized church and things like that. I really didn't like that kind of environment, um, and I always felt like there was something much bigger that was out there waiting for me to tap into it. And I think that's where, for me, that constant reaching, the constant curiosity led me from one step to another through my high school, university years. I kept getting closer and closer through studying Buddhism and meditation, and finally through this curiosity of the Sufi poets in particular. That led me to more and more of the reach for Sufism, until I finally one day had the thought to actually ask the question, is this actually a living tradition? Because everything I'd read was from like the 14th century or earlier. And so I didn't even think about it as anything other than like a literary tradition. And so it's like, why didn't I think of this, 8 years ago, 10 years ago? And when I did, I found out there are all kinds of people involved in it all around the world. And that really opened up my eyes for the explorations that I would say are very much alive and current for me now. So that's a bit of a rambling recap of me, but it's kind of going from restriction to opening is how I would describe it, and learning how to be with the multiplicity of the world, all the diversity of people and ideas, and still have a way to navigate that with integrity and also openness toward all of it.
Wow, that's wonderful. Um, Even kind of what you were saying about just poetry, I know you're a poet yourself, and kind of moving into that space, familiar with Rumi and some of that work. But if you could just explain, maybe what were some of like the major poems that pointed you towards that direction, or that really touched your heart to make that direct move towards Sufism.
Well, okay, so it's hard to pinpoint specific poems. There are a couple of them that are by Rumi, and if I'd known that question was coming, I would have brought a couple of titles with me. There's one
Go
really
ahead.
famous one.
Follow.
Oh, no, 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 you're good. The one really famous one, though, that a lot of people actually might have heard before, is certainly one that I come back to a lot. It's called The Guest House. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just the first line of it starts with, "This being human is a guest house." And the whole point of the poem is, it's like having all of these different energies and people coming through this space that you occupy. And you have to keep making room for them. You have to welcome them in, even if you don't want them there. And that's the whole
Mm,
point of this. It's a real, just kind of description of what it's like to live in the world, where constantly things are changing and we don't ask for what comes or who comes into our lives, but we have to make space for it. And the more that we can do that, the more we can really stay connected and stay in our own sense of wholeness. Um, Another one, really quick, is, I'm just going to mention the name of this whole, well, a couple of volumes actually of Hafiz that I love. Rumi and Hafiz are probably two of my most favorite. But Hafiz, this one in my, I'd say like my, yeah, kind of mid 20s, I was going through a really dark time, and I happened to come across this book just pretty randomly in a bookstore that was called "I Heard God Laughing," and it was by Hafiz. And the translator of that is this guy Daniel Ladensky, who just has the most like heartfelt, funny. I mean, these poems will make you laugh and cry. They're really just so well rendered into English that yeah, that book, I mean, it was just like, there's this one night where I was just, I really felt like I was hitting, just the bottom of the well. That's exactly what it felt like. And I just remember I was so depressed and discouraged with what was going on. I had just moved back to the US, um, 2 weeks before 9/11 happened. I'd been living in Canada, and then I'd been in Japan for a couple of years. And I had just moved back. I had no prospects, I had no contacts. And then 9/11 happened, and there were no jobs. And it was so low of a time with everything going on. And I just remember this one night, it was that feeling. I was actually falling, and I was lying at the bottom of a well, that was so deep that looking up to the mouth of it, it was just like a little tiny pinpoint of light. Like that's how deep it was. And I just remember kind of like, I was just like, oh, thrashing around on the floor. And then my hand kind of like went out and I hit something. And I looked over and it was this book and it was Hafiz and I heard God laughing and I just exploded into this like release of laughter and like tears and snot. And it was just like such an opening moment for me. And I read a few of the poems that night. And I just remember it was just like a big yes. It was just this huge invitation to it's just like stay with this deep suck that you're in right now. It's so hard right now. And just stay with it. Stay with it. Stay with it. Because everything that's alive eventually passes. You know, it's eventually going to pass. You just have to ride this out. So that was the message that I got really clearly. And that really helped me gradually to get back on my feet. And then there's a whole other story about the mental health piece and all of that. So, but those are how some of the poems have really personally affected me, and I read them still pretty often, and I'm always kind of chewing on them and just kind of, oh yeah, that's good, that's good. That really is speaking to me right now. Like, just read one the other day that the line goes, "Love comes with a knife." You know, how's it go? Love comes with a knife, not some shy question or fears for its reputation. It's just like, whoa. Okay, that's Rumi, by the way. That's Rumi. Um, but there's always this encouragement to like go in and deeper and down into what you are. And that's really where the Sufi path drew me in because it's this constant going inward and inward and inward and really and at the same time opening outward into the world that's here and really being in it, having both of your feet on the ground so that you're solid, you're living in the world, but you're also really, really connected in yourself and to that real essence of what you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's kind of how I've my spiritual path has kind of really come about. It really, I feel like it started more so just during the pandemic. I was hitting a real all-time low. I was working for the city with pandemic response, with everything that was kind of going on, and at the same time, during that time, as I was actually struggling with my own drug addiction. You know, at the same time, then everything kind of boom, like womp, like went really dark for me, and like I was just felt helpless, and then that's really when these signs kind of started coming about, and I went into recovery. And then fast forward, now have been in a Shakti yoga school for the past 9 months. I'm at Thousand Sons Academy, my teacher Raja Chowdhury, and it's really changed my life in the ability to go in deep, but not just that, but to be of the world and to work within the world and to be kind of a light or work towards developing, you know, a light within myself. And so I think that that's really interesting. Like you're saying, you know, kind of tough times can bring that out. If you could just explain a little bit, I guess, for the audience and for myself, like what, like you were speaking about Sufism. You know, it's not just like in these books. It kind of like reminds me just a little bit of like alchemy. You know, like what an alchemist is nowadays. Like, you know, some people might look at the book The Alchemist but not know that people do, you know, a ton of spiritual work around alchemy. So like with Sufism, like I know there's just books, but like what is really like the path that you have taken, and I believe you're a guide as well, so what does that look like?
Hmm. This is a complicated question because Sufism, just for a bit of context, is first of all, it's not really an ism because it's not a religion.
Mm-hmm.
It is really it might be more accurate to call it a method of living, a method of being fully human, rather than a particular dogma or creed or set of rules. It's not like that. Um, so contemporary Sufism is something that many people have different ideas about. Okay, so Sufism is best known for the expression that it had during the Islamic years of like the real flourishing of the Islamic world. So even starting around the year 700 all the way up until even the 1500s, 1600s, Sufism really blossomed within the context of Islam and the Middle East and Persia and Turkey and all the places where that religion spread. Some people will call, many people actually will describe Sufism as Islamic mysticism. And while it is absolutely a mystical path in the sense that it's a direct experiential way of being, that's a simple way of describing mysticism, is having the direct experience of absorption or oneness or connection with all that is. And so from that view, either from a contemporary Sufi standpoint or even going back, because Sufism, again, we call it Sufism, but it wasn't only ever called that. These are methods that involve psychology, that involve our habits, that involve self-inquiry, that involve engagement with people, that involve spiritual practices, including concentration and contemplation and meditation, that many other traditions use. But this is a stream of human wisdom that has been continuous, and Sufis of all kinds acknowledge this. And so if you look back in the traditions, even through the Islamic stream, which is pretty much what everything we have today came out of, but even the old Sufis talked about the sources of Sufism long before there was Islam, before there was Christianity, before there was Judaism, before there was Zoroastrianism, back through Egypt, back through ancient Greece, to the earliest times that humans were exploring the cosmos and exploring these big spiritual questions. So the essence, if you want to put it that way, is it's really about seeing beyond it's often called the false self or the small self. So it's the protective shell of the ego identity, which we need to be functional in the world. But it often gets mistaken for our true self, when in reality, it's more an expression of our survival instincts. It's a very intelligent adaptation of our survival instincts to an increasingly complex world. But the essence of the teachings, I mean, you get a lot of teachings. If you've read Rumi, you'll come across all of this, what sounds like love poetry, but it's really being addressed to the essence of what we all are, the source of what we all are, which we are not separate from. And so the real task of it is about seeing through that, seeing through this identification that we have with our history, our personal struggles, the jobs that we have, the people that we know, our families, our history. It's loosening the hold of that and being able to recognize that while that all has given flavor and texture to ourselves and how we see ourselves in the world, what we actually are is so much beyond that we don't even have words for it. The only way to know it is to be it. And so there's we should probably keep it light today, because there's a lot of complexity that you can go into as far as how people that have followed the Sufi path have done this. But I would say that one of the things that really struck me is the Sufi stream that I became part of about officially about 15 years ago, is the idea of, there are a couple of core ideas actually. One of them is this idea that Sufism is always changing. Okay, it changes to match the historical context of whatever's going on in society. So there has to be a relevance to it. It has to match up with people and what they're experiencing now, whatever that is. So that's a bit of a rule, if you want to call it that. But because of that, the expression of it outwardly is always changing. What it takes to reach people is always a little bit different over times and periods and cultures. But because it's doing that, it's able to maintain the integrity of its message, of its teaching. And so in a way, it's never changing because it's always changing to meet the times. It's able to carry the core of that through time and history. And then another one that's a really core idea is that it's really about something that we're not very good at in Western culture, which is this idea of love or loving. I mean, we have a lot of teachings about it. I mean, the entire Christian tradition is built on that. If you take what was actually taught by Jesus, okay, that's more or less what he was talking about all the time. I mean, that kind of, all the craziness of the Old Testament is a whole other thing, but the real message of Christianity was always love. But I never quite saw that in action or how it's supposed to work until I got it through the Sufi lens. And after that, I'm like, okay, yeah, the Christian thing, they have something there. It's just it gets lost in the muddle of all of these politics and the different identifications that people have that are much more cultural than anything else. So it kind of gets lost. But there's this idea that one of the things that gets us through our dark times, our confrontations and struggles that we have with others, is this idea that you can always love more. And it's a hard lesson. It's a hard lesson, especially when we point that at ourselves. So like you were saying with the dark times and falling into addictive patterns. I've had similar experience. It wasn't with substance, but my my whole adult life was marked by a traumatic brain injury that was quite severe that I had just before I turned 18. And the injuries and the aftermath of that, it's with me today. I mean, it's I became a different version of me at that moment and thereafter. So that's also a big piece of my pattern that has been influential in the questions that I've asked and how I've gone about looking for them, which for me included a lot of isolating myself and not wanting to be seen by other people because I felt really ashamed of what I thought I had become, just less, this diminished self. And that's that small self speaking. It's the one that's identified with the pain and injury and loss of function and all of that. And so that's just an example of how that can express and why we have to see through it because it's not the whole story. It's not even, it feels big, but it's such just a relative little slice of the whole thing. So uh, give you
Wow.
give you a chance to say something.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for sharing that. I really appreciate you sharing a bit about that experience and kind of, how that hasn't really, defined you so much now, as in you're not just that one moment. You've done so much work from that, or so much of your life has like blossomed maybe from, you know traumatic experience, kind of like the, I guess, the yin yang, whole part of the equation of life. And um so I wanted to, I guess, ask you a little bit about the way that you have applied maybe some of your spiritual beliefs with your mental health work. And I know you have a background in psychology and early year education and such. And so, like, through the school that I belong to, our teacher is kind of like speaking about what you're saying is like really just being, you know, a light in the world of just doing good things, like not really being dogmatic, not trying to tell people what to do. His whole thing is, be your own guru, be your own light, and like just do, you know, be strong and do positive things and apply that into the world. Like, don't, necessarily like meditate away in the cave and like, just forget about the whole world. Like, be a part of the world and help that. And that's a place where I'm in, is that I work in the recovery industry, as in I work in sober houses and I do coaching. And so I'm, implementing my sadhana and practices to go into, those spaces and be a positive presence, instead of letting, that environment affect me too much. So I guess, how did you kind of, you know, take your spiritual practices and put that into your work, and how has that looked for you?
Okay, well, I first of all want to just humanize myself a bit because I don't want to make it sound like I got my act together and then I had all the answers and then I did all the right moves, because that is not how it happened for me. Um, what
Got you.
what I would say, let me just unpack a couple of things you said, because one of
Hmm.
them is it's about the light and all of that, and I really do see that one of the challenges that most, if not all of us, face is what our light actually is. What does that mean? And so much of it's not
Hmm.
so much about shining it more brightly. I really don't think we have any control over the brightness. Everyone has bright light. We all come from the same light. It's all bright. It's all light.
Hmm.
So what it's about is uncovering it. It's about opening to experiences that allow it to shine outward from us. And in a way, we kind of owe that to each other, to show our light, because it's something that it just makes the way better, more welcoming, even easier for all of us when we can do that. I mean, there's such a difference. I'm sure you've had this experience where when you're sitting in a space where there's trust and there's openness and people aren't guarded. And I mean, you could say that's okay, well, that's being vulnerable. Well, it is. I mean, loving is vulnerable, showing who you are is vulnerable. Uh, Not knowing what's going on is vulnerable. I mean, basically anything that we do that makes us grow and that makes us connect with anyone else and the world is vulnerable. But those are the things that uncover that light. And a lot of times the light we have isn't even something we knew about. We find out things about ourselves as we go. And it comes in little increments. It's almost like taking off layers. You go on a hike and you're all layered up with your coat and your jacket under that, and you got a zip up and you got a long sleeve shirt and a short sleeve shirt. So it's kind of like you're peeling off these layers and finding out what's under it as time goes by. And so, and the other thing I wanted to comment on really quickly is it's just this idea of doing good in the world, because I know I have felt that pressure intensely at times that I should, I ought to, I must do good in the world. I need to leave the world better than I found it. I need to be, I always kind of had a love hate relationship with this phrase of being like a productive person, or, you know, doing something good in society. And I just have to say that what I have learned, and this is what the Sufi path has really helped me to see more clearly, sort of bringing it into my work and my expression in the world, is that it's not always just about doing good deeds. It's about showing up to the moment. It's about taking care of this moment. And a lot of times, it's not what we think. It's not even what we want or ask for. In fact, what might actually be good in the world for the world is something we hate doing at the time. And so there's really a question that has really guided me, that one of my teachers gave to me a long time ago, is this question of what wants to happen, and just asking yourself what wants to happen. Because when you can slow down and ask yourself that question and leave a little pause for something to come to you, maybe not an answer even, but just asking that question, it's a bit of going from a blinders view to just starting to open it up to more possibilities and taking in more of what's here. And to me, that's really the essence of an answer to your question, is that it's been a gradual process of opening up my blinders again and again and again, constantly, so that I can take in more of what wants to happen. And with my background in psychology and education, I've combined that over the years with being trained in trauma work, trauma studies, functional nutritional therapy, and really bringing together just an understanding of how to look at somebody as a whole person, with all of their history, all of their experience, all of the things that have happened to them that have knocked them down and put them back on their feet again, how they've beaten themselves up, the things that they've learned. And probably most important for me has actually been the body aspect, that functional nutritional therapy piece, because for me, that was something that I had to learn to do for myself. I had to realize that my physical being is the vehicle for every kind of experience that I have. It's also the filter for all of the experiences I have. So when my body is not doing well and it's suffering because I'm not nourishing it and I'm not sleeping enough and I'm eating horribly and maybe I'm drinking too much, whatever I've done, those things all are like putting on those layers again that cover that light. So for me, having the direct experience of learning how to functionally support my physical being, I've really learned to realize that this physical body is no different, not separate from what we call spirit and spirituality. So the spiritual path for me includes every aspect of my physical body as well and my physical life. There's no separation between them. And so it's an act of honor to that path to really take care of my body. And it's something I can tell you, I wouldn't be here talking with you today if I hadn't done that, because I would have been, you know, either successfully suicidal at some point along the way, or at least just deeply miserable and in very poor health. And so I've been able to take those things that I have learned, tested them out, put them into work in my own life, just checking them. And this is the most important thing about any spiritual path, is that you're not just taking someone else's words for it. Teachers are really helpful because they can show us more direct, obvious paths than we might see. Okay. Anyone who's a little bit further ahead has a better view of the path because they've walked it. So they can be very helpful to us, but we're the only ones that walk our own path. I mean, no one else does it, obviously. So we have to test it for ourselves at each step and say, yep, this works. Or no, that practice, okay, I can see why it was recommended, but it's not doing anything for me. And it's okay to set those aside. The whole point of exercises and practices that we call spiritual is to give us a lift. It's to give us a greater view, a higher vantage point to see this whole big picture from. And if they're not doing that for us, they're not of much use. So yeah, doing the work and working with mental health became something else for me that again, it has that spiritual dimension to it, because it involves all of who I am in relation to all of what other people are, and especially the people I was working with. So whether it was kids or state troopers who are always armed and often in a not a great mood because they're stressed out all the time, finding that way of saying, hey, you know what, if I was in your shoes I would probably be just like that, and having that ability to just take that one little step forward toward the other person. And I'll finish this line of thought here with one thing that was very helpful for me in the psychology work and the mental health work that I've done. And it's this idea of the platinum rule. And not a lot of people seem to have heard of this. It's mostly therapists that seem to have come across this, but many of us know the golden rule, which is basically saying what's good for me is going to be good for other people. So I'm going to treat people the way I like, and then that way they'll treat me, similarly. But it's basically just saying if I like something and it's good for me, then it's probably good for everyone. This platinum rule kind of flips that on its head, and it's saying don't make it about me. Ask the other person what's good for them. So the platinum rule is treat others the way they want to be treated. And I found that little rule that was developed by a psychologist has been really consistent with my spiritual path as well. And it's really opened me up to be able to work with and sit with and be with whoever comes into my field of view. I mean, in work, on the street, in my personal life, that has been a really, really monumental mover for me to have that little bit of knowledge.
Wow, that's that was really helpful for me, and I'm sure helpful for many people who are going to be listening to this. I think that what I was taking away from what you're talking about, the functional nutritional therapy, is to be or to give the moment what it needs. You kind of have to be aligned or in that flow state when it comes to your health, to allow yourself to, remove those layers and be that kind of present, you know, light or just sense of self. And then kind of what you were speaking about with that platinum rule, and just being attentive to what the other person might need, to, no matter, who they are, without kind of discrimination. I think that that's something that I'm going to take and try to really apply to my personal life and work, because even, through doing a lot of spiritual practice, it can be hard to, remember those things or align one's life in that specific way. I think for me, I know that you've done a lot of intensive meditation, mindfulness, and I wanted you just to speak a little bit about breath work, because I think some of the breath work that I've done has been some of the most helpful when it comes to dealing with anxiety or stressors. I live in New York City, and there's kind of always stressors, everywhere. And breath work has really helped me with dealing with all of the complex moments that happen within like a complex space like New York or wherever. So I guess if you could speak about a little bit to the breath work that you have done, and believe you also have a background in musical, D&D, somatic meditation practices. If you could just speak to those things.
Yeah, yeah. So what all of these things have in common, and you kind of alluded to this a moment ago, but I just want to say it explicitly, is to engage with ourselves or others in a new way that's open. The key skill that it requires is listening. And listening can happen on many different sensory and mental levels in our being. It's not just sounds in our ears listening. It's a deep way of opening ourselves up. And so breath work, so the breath work, let me just say, I'll give you a little bit about what I've done and what I've learned from that. And then if you have any follow-up questions, please ask them if there's something more specific you want to get at. But for me, my entry into breath work came from starting out with um, Buddhist studies and then yoga. I did yoga for a long time. My wife was a long time yoga teacher and yoga therapist. She's very, very deep in that tradition and has been for nearly 30 years. And so, and then you'll be talking to her too, and you'll see that she's a bright light as well. But so there's a lot of that, the breath work that comes through the yogic tradition, and of really activating our subtle energy centers or chakras. That's something that when you're first doing it, you have all of these new sensory experiences as you make connections with your body in particular that you may have not done before. It's kind of like this big wake up process that happens, and it can be really profound, really exciting emotionally and mentally to have this happening. The challenge with breath work as a practice is it's a method. Again, it's a method. It's not an end in itself. What it helps to do and what it historically has been used for is a way of settling our physical bodies, settling our minds, so that we can be in this state of oneness, of pure awareness, of having this kind of direct line of this kind of source energy that we are one with, and being able to have the direct experience of that. So, in a way, all breath work in that sense is preparation for that experience from a traditional spiritual path perspective. Okay, whether it's a Sufi path or it's a yoga path or many of the others, even many Christian contemplative traditions use breathing practices. So I've done a number of these. We have a kind of heart rhythm based meditation practice that we might use. We use breathing practices that might involve exhaling a sound or a word that becomes a real concentration point and kind of a guide for opening. Um, On the physiological level, of course, this is the way breath work is being taught primarily these days in a not explicitly spiritual context, is what can I get for it? What's the thing that's going to give me the biggest bang for my buck? Because I'm stressed out, anxious, I'm nervous, I worry all the time. I don't know what the future is going to bring. It freaks me out. So what can you do to help me come down off of that? And that, honestly, that's a fair question. That's where a lot of people start, and it's a good starting point because it's a starting point. You have to start somewhere to get in on the journey. So any way in is the right way in. So from that standpoint, I mean, I used breath work with police. I used it with emergency dispatchers as a way of showing that you can have a different experience even in highly stressful circumstances. And so, one of the most common breathing practices that's used in, tactical settings, whether it's military or police, is what's called square breathing or box breathing. And that's just a way of creating stability and rhythm inside of your nervous system. And it's used to bring people down. And it's very simple. You just, inhale for 4 breaths, hold it for 4 breaths, exhale for 4 breaths, hold it for 4 breaths, and then repeat. So that's why it's called a box or a square, because on all 4 sides you have 4 beats. So inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 4, hold 4. It's a very simple way of feeling connection back with your physical being. Because if you're not doing that, the natural result is going to be fight or flight. And so many people don't even know that they're at least operating from that on a low level all the time. So the breath work brings us back. It brings us back to stable ground internally. It opens up the possibility of us not coming from a reactive place when our tensions run high and when there are tough situations that we're dealing with in real time. So it's very practical on that level. But it has that kind of double quality of being useful in day-to-day life to do things. But on its own, it's also a powerful preparatory exercise to have this direct experience of this, you know, it's hard to even put into words. Just it works both ways. So there's another part to your question, and I think I've lost it. Tell me if there's more that you want me to add to that.
No, no, no. I think it was just talking about the functional breath work and speaking about musical somatic meditation
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
practices. Those were just
that's right. That's right. Yeah, a lot of the so there's the Sufi tradition. We do a lot of embodied. You could call it body prayers. Um, there are these. I mean, some of them are really quite beautiful. I actually just got back 3 days ago from the Netherlands, from a gathering there of these international Sufi communities, and it was a really beautiful experience to be together in this very conscious way. And some of what we do is they're very slow, deliberate motions. You can do them by yourself, you can do them with others. And that's a way of embodying what we might think of as prayer or meditation, that it really takes us out of our habitual patterns. Because if we really look, even how we sit, how we stand, how we position ourselves when there are others around, we have habits that have formed from our personal history, from our ancestral history, even going further back than any of us can know. So much of that has been handed to us, and then we've adapted to it, and we don't even realize we're doing it. So, starting to move in deliberate ways as a way of meditating, especially slowly, very slow, deliberate movement. Sometimes with music, and some of the musical meditations that we do in this particular tradition that I'm part of, um, we do musical. You can call it musical prayer, musical meditation, where it's a bit like using. Well, it's not always a mantra. Sometimes we use words, and they could be. Sometimes they're Arabic. Sometimes they're Latin, sometimes they are Persian, sometimes they're from other languages, depending on what tradition we pulled it from. But we might use music and a repetition of kind of a cycle of rhythm and melody to kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper into this meditation together. And most often we'll do these in groups in that setting. It's a very powerful way of using our kind of mammal group energy to really activate opening in us. Because when it comes down to it, we don't thrive alone. We can't actually live alone without other people. Maybe for a period of time we can, but even being able to do that is because other people exist and have helped made the world the way it is so that we can live away from them. But we have that quality and capacity in us that needs others. And so many of these practices are about holding and recognizing that connection in a way that deepens our experience of it so we can take it back out into the world. I mean, that's really the point of any of it, is to bring it back out into the world. And like I was saying, that loving, that light that we have to offer becomes brighter just by default of doing these practices that open us up. We have to keep doing them again and again.
It's very beautiful, and it's very important. Like you're saying, just continually doing them for that aim and goal. And I really liked what you were saying, just about kind of all of us needing each other, whether we acknowledge it or understand it. Not, it's kind of like we need each other, we need the planet, we need all of these different aspects that belong to our consciousness, whether we are aware of it or not. I wanted you to, I guess, last thing really wanted you to touch on was some of your courses. You're teaching, I believe you co-teach along with your wife with the mind, body, spirit, and that kind of approach. So if you could talk about that approach and some of the programs that our listeners and people can kind of access.
Yeah. Yeah. So the work that my wife Masami and I have developed, um, it's an integration of what I've talked about. Actually, it's bringing the support of the physical body through educational process. I mean, we have to learn what that involves and how to take care of it. So that's something that I desperately wish we all learned that starting in kindergarten, if not before. It just I so hate the fact that it's not part of our society to begin with. Because for us, the more we do it, the more obvious it is that these very, very basic things in many cases are really the foundation that's lacking for so many people. And their physical health and then their mental health stands on top of that. It grows out of the physical body because the energy that you have in your mental capacity comes through the physical energy that you put into it and that the body can produce and sustain. So those are connected. And even our spiritual expression is a further expression of that foundation and keeping it solid. So just how much we're able to open ourselves and explore that domain. So the work that we do, we do teach classes. Most of them have a health focus. Right now, Masami's big focus is on helping women reconnect with their rhythms of with the moon cycles. And this isn't just for women having their periods; it's also for women post menopause who have lost connection. Because a lot of women, they hit that point, and basically society just kind of puts them on the sidelines and says, "Yeah, you're done. You can't have kids anymore. Not interested." And our whole medical establishment is more or less like that. And so there's more than half of our human population already feels shut out of a lot of experiences because they're women or female. And that's a huge problem right there. But then there's this added issue. So she's focusing a lot on that right now in her work. And so that's where a lot of our support goes. But we also give educational programs that you can sign up for either through our YouTube channel or through the website. And we do free content. Usually we'll do a webinar each month and educate people about how to get the right nutrients into their bodies to build that foundation and keep it solid over time. I can't tell you how transformative that's been for both Masami and me. I would not be here today if I hadn't gone through this process for many years already myself. So yeah, so that's where you can find out more. Our website, the easiest one to remember is the URL with her name, which is masamicovey.com. So that's MASAMICOVEY.com. And I'm on there as well. You can connect with us there if you want to leave a message or anything like that. And if you're curious about the Sufi work and the education that I'm doing on that front, there's more coming there as well. And you can learn more about some of that at sufiway.org. Okay, sufiway.org. That's SUFI way.org. And so there will be more happening over the coming months and years, most certainly on that front too. So yeah, I don't know. This whole conversation, I'm really excited to be here talking about this. It means the world to me to be able to share my experiences, and I really appreciate the invitation from you. And there's a whole lot more I could go into and talk about, and I'd love to have those conversations too. But it's just it's so important for us to understand. Just as kind of a last thought for me is that we all get loaded up. You know, life loads us up, and we're often looking for ways to unload that, and sometimes we just blast it out on other people. And so there's this finesse that we have to learn, and that's part of the spiritual journey, is learning how to be graceful about it, learning how to give and receive, and in a way that is ultimately more loving than we thought we could do, because that means we're sharing our generosity with others when we give them something that we also need, which is love and attention and support. That's real generosity. That's how Sufis would describe it. So I'll leave you with that thought. If there's anything else I can add, just let me know. But thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. We will link all of the places where people can find your work, and thank you for leaving us with so many gems. Hopefully, we can do a follow up conversation in the future, and speak a little bit more, because there's so many different things that you've done, and I just want to thank you for your energy and your presence, and you've definitely helped me along my spiritual journey just through this conversation, and I'm sure many other people. So thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you again. And just a last thought for the audience is
Yep.
just start with a question. Just start with a
Mm.
question. That's the first step to developing your own spiritual journey and finding out that real depth of who you are. Just start with a question and let it stay open. Okay.
Mm.
So thank you, Christian. Appreciate it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Chris.